Welcome to Acura. I'm James Carden. Today is the second in a series of conversations we will be having over the coming months with distinguished and thoughtful members of experts on Russia, Ukraine, and the post-Soviet space. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by an old friend, Dr. Pietro Shakarian. Pietro is a historian and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Historical Research at the National Research University Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg, Russia. He earned his doctorate in history at The Ohio State University and has previously taught at the American University of Armenia in Yerevan. He is a widely sought after writer and podcast guest, and so we're very happy to have you here today.
James, it's a great pleasure to be on your show. As always, it's wonderful.
I guess let's start with where you are. So you're in St. Petersburg, Russia, and we've touched upon this before recording. So maybe you could tell us, us Americans, about the mood there, what life is there, what life is like there, and maybe the prevailing opinions with regard to the ongoing war in Ukraine.
Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me on, James. It's wonderful to be here. Second of all, I want to just clarify, how I ended up, what I'm doing here really in St. Petersburg as a postdoctoral fellow. And really, I'm in the process, and we're going to get to this, I think, later on in our discussion. I'm in the process of completing my book on Anastas Mikoyan and Soviet nationality policy during the thaw. It's a very understudied, under-researched subject. And so my monograph, I think, will contribute substantially to our knowledge of Soviet history in this sphere of nationalities, and also the high politics, really, in the political center. So that's kind of to give you a sense, why I'm here. That it began with that. I'm also doing teaching on the side. I'm also involved with organizing conferences. I just organized a conference with Russian and Armenian historians here in St. Petersburg. So that's kind of the backdrop. Now, as for my life here, one thing I would say is that it's incredible. It always strikes me when I'm in Russia in particular, in the post-Soviet space in general, but in Russia in particular, how disconnected the Western and specifically American mainstream media narratives are from the reality as it actually is in Russia. And that's really something quite stunning to me. So as you know, James, a few years ago, I was living in Moscow, and then I came back. This was during the period of the coronavirus, pandemic, or as the Russians would say, coronavirus. And so I ended up back in the United States, in my hometown, Cleveland, Ohio. I was writing my dissertation, finishing my dissertation, really. And I met people there, and I was talking to them about Russia, and they would ask me, how was it? And not only how was it, they would ask me questions like, are people starving? Do people have enough food? And that to me was a really shocking question, because it encapsulated in many ways everything wrong with American perceptions of Russia. I mean, it's almost like as if people were thinking that this was the Russian Civil War, or the period of the early 1930s in southern Russia and Ukraine under Stalin with the collectivization. Like they don't know. I mean, it was just stunning to me.
There's also
the degree of ignorance.
There's a big misperception here, I think, about the efficacy of sanctions. So I think.
Oh yeah. Well, no, I'm just going to set the record on that straight right now. The sanctions have completely and utterly failed, James. Please, if there's anybody, any of our audience members who are under the impression that somehow they're working in some way, I will disabuse them of that notion immediately, because it simply is not true. All you have to do is just walk out of my apartment in St. Petersburg. I have about maybe 7 grocery stores that are in very short walking distance from where I live. You can throw a rock and hit a grocery store. Now, I wouldn't recommend you do that, but that's how much is here. And these are well-stocked grocery stores. and the prices are incredibly low. So even when they talk about inflation of egg prices, that's very, very minor in Russia. I mean, the inflation here there was barely any inflation here versus what you see in the West. You could make the case, James, that the sanctions have worked incredibly well on the West and not on Russia. Because if you're in the United States, and I've been back to the States, it's incredible how high the prices have risen since this whole, Ukrainian debacle began. And that's, it's an incredible disconnect from what the real situation is on the ground here.
And of
So if
course,
you go over to, like, I just want to say this, that if you go over and you were to buy a carton of eggs here in St. Petersburg, that'd be about maybe 129 rubles. And we're talking about maybe it'd be like $1.45. Now, I'm talking about a carton of eggs, 10 eggs, 129 rubles. And think about that. That'd be like $1.45. How much is it in Washington, D.C., where you are?
quite a bit more.
So explain to me what were you going to say? I mean,
Well, no, I was just also going to point out that not only has the American economy suffered from the COVID supply chain disruption, and then, of course, the boomerang effect of the sanctions, now we have the coming supply chain disruption due to the war that's the naval war that's happening in the Red Sea. So,
well, that's another whole debate. I mean, it's just amazing though that this is all self-imposed. It didn't have to happen like this. I mean, as we know, our mutual friends, the late great Steve Cohen, would always point us in the direction of alternatives in Russian and Soviet history. He loved talking about that topic, as we know. But it's also applicable, and Steve would agree with this, it's also applicable to American history. There were a lot of moments in American history where the road was not taken, right? And even especially if we look at, in particular, these last 25 to 30 years, where the American political system has faced significant challenges and crises, there were possibilities for reform. We look at 2008 when Obama was elected. There was an opportunity for Obama to do reform. You could even make the case, even if you're not a fan of his, that Trump maybe had an opportunity to do some reforms. But these opportunities were in the end passed by, and the crisis in the American system continued to deepen. And now we are in a place where we have these economic issues, and it was entirely avoidable.
Yep.
It was entirely avoidable. That's what's so ridiculous about this. That you look at all the problems America now has, these were issues that we could have avoided.
Well, that's exactly the thesis of Richard Sakwa's new book, and we just had Richard on. I think he'll appear on Monday, and the new book is called The Lost Peace, and it looks really at all these kind of roads not taken over the past 30 years with regard to U.S. Russia policy. And, I guess that would kind of bring us to, how in your estimation could the road to war in Ukraine over the past several decades, been avoided? It seems to me that even in the immediate months prior to February 2022, there were off ramps available to the administration that it refused to take. Worse than that, they seemed intent on trying to provoke Russia. For instance, with the U.S.-Ukrainian strategic charter that was signed in November of 2021.
Yeah.
So, do you see, what kind of important, opportunities do you think were missed that could?
Well, I think what was striking to me, I'm gonna give some background on this. That actually, when President Biden began his administration, he had a choice whether or not to pursue détente with Russia, seriously, or to escalate the confrontation. And Unfortunately, his administration took the road of confrontation, and they took the road of confrontation very early on. This was signaled already in January 2021 when Michael McFaul published a piece in Foreign Affairs talking about how to contain Putin. So already there, you understood that this was kind of the trajectory that this administration was going to go on. That's not even counting, as you know, James, the rather unfortunate meeting that Secretary of State Blinken had in Anchorage, with the Chinese, and how that did not go down very well. So but it was a preview of things to come. It was like we looked at it and we saw, oh, the guy is completely out of his depth here and and all that. But in truth, it was a preview of what we're seeing now, right? And actually, what's interesting now is the fact that they have provoked the American government, the current government has provoked all these conflicts in different parts of the world. And now they're attempting to kind of do damage control. So all of a sudden now we see this growing crisis in relations between the US and Iran.
Yeah.
And now the US is trying to step back from the brink saying, oh, no, we don't really want a war with Iran. We want to kind of pull back, right? But in truth, they've been provoking these conflicts with Russia, China, Iran, all these countries for quite some time. And specifically with Russia, one of the things I observed now, I was actually in Yerevan. I was teaching at the American University of Armenia as this was all happening. And the question then becomes, as what was all happening? Well, the growing confrontation between the United States on one hand and Russia on the other over Ukraine. So the Ukraine war, to kind of give our listeners some background, the Ukraine war had been kind of put on ice after the Minsk Accords were implemented. And of course, there were ceasefire violations throughout all those 8 years, as we know. But suddenly it seemed in 2021 as if this conflict was going to head towards some reignition. Now, I want to point our listeners to a very excellent scholarly assessment of and breakdown of the events leading up to the beginning of the special military operation in February 2022, outlined by Jeffrey Roberts, a great historian who has written this article, Now or Never, about Putin's decision to go to war in Ukraine. And he follows the official statements of the Russian government, right? Now, as the late great Moshe Levine would say, the best way to kind of get to understand a man or to understand any or woman or any historical figure is to look at what they're saying officially in their speeches. Okay. And so often when we're looking at the Russian government, I mean, it's not okay. So you have analysts, so-called analysts in the West who say, well, yes, that's what they're saying officially, but what are they really thinking? What are they really planning? But in truth, usually most of the time, if you're a serious Russianist, if you're a serious expert on Russian affairs, most of the time, what they say officially is what they mean, right? The Russians don't pull any punches. And it was very clear, if you've been watching the news all throughout 2021 and into January 2022, that the United States and the United Kingdom were provoking the Russians in Ukraine. They were provoking this new conflict in Ukraine. Russia at some point got tired of the whole situation. They made an offer saying, we don't want to have NATO expanded anymore. We want NATO off the table in Ukraine. Right now, some in the West interpreted this as an ultimatum, but really the Russians put it out there as a starting point for negotiations. They didn't want this war. They didn't want any conflict. In fact, the behavior was very restrained, frankly. If you're looking at it from a Russian point of view, it was very restrained. And yet the United States and the UK were provoking until finally you had this outbreak of hostilities in February 2022. Now, what happened? What was the objective of that? Was Putin content on conquering the entirety of Ukraine, right? Because this was what the immediate assessment was in the Western press. Many people in the world interpreted this to be the case, but It was clear also, if you looked at the number of troops that the Russians were sending, for instance, to Kiev, that they were not interested in conquering Ukraine, but really to kind of put pressure
Yeah.
on the Kiev regime to come to the table and negotiate. So it was a strong way to kind of force the regime really to go into talks. And for a while, the Ukrainians were pursuing this. They actually had agreed to, go along that line. But what happened? Well, the Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, swept in and he told the Ukrainians, no, 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 no. And this is in March 2022. Now, think about the timeline here. The conflict begins in February 2022.
Hold on one second, though, because you bring
Okay.
up Johnson and you bring up Istanbul. And I'm sure that you've noticed that over the past couple of months, there's a sort of disagreement that has emerged among some experts, whether or not, that was as an important marker as some of us believe.
No, I think what's no,
I mean,
no, I was one.
So no, but I mean, basically what I mean is, have you seen the pieces by, really, really good scholars like David Hendrickson, who dispute that, Istanbul was all it was cracked up to be, that their
No.
theory is that they weren't really that close, therefore, it wasn't really that important. I don't share that view. I think that
I don't share that. I don't share the view either,
but you're
because
familiar
we've
with
had
the
statements.
discussion I'm
Oh
talking
yeah, no, no, no.
about.
I'm absolutely, and I say it's interesting to me that these kind of claims come out all of a sudden now, much later in the game. I mean, where you seeing, that from the point of view of the State Department, from their point of view, their team is losing, right? Right? It's like the Browns in the fourth quarter, I mean, versus the Texans, all right? That now it's very clear that they're losing the game.
Yeah.
And they're trying to do damage control, and they're trying to say, well, no, 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 Boris Johnson, he really wasn't, as significant as people thought he was. But then how do you explain these Ukrainian, these members of the Ukrainian negotiating team who are coming forward all of a sudden and saying, well, no, no, no. As a matter of fact, we were talking to the Russians. We were very close to a peace deal. And then, Boris Johnson, on behalf of the United States government, told us, no, 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 you should keep fighting. And you have to think how scandalous this is, because look at how horrific the Ukrainian death toll has been in this war, in particular particularly since the much vaunted counteroffensive that we've seen. But think about the dates. What the Russians call the SMO, Special Military Operation, that began in February 2022, at the end of the month. The negotiations we're talking about, that's in March 2022. All right. So a lot of lives could have been saved had, they concluded an agreement where Ukraine would have been neutral.
Yeah.
They would have had to give autonomy to Donbass, but they wouldn't have lost Donbass. Crimea, they would have lost that. But let's be honest, the train has already left the station on that one. I mean, that's not coming back anytime soon.
I think
but lives could have been saved, James. That's the most important thing here. That the lives, those Ukrainian lives, they matter. That we cannot by doing this, by pursuing this kind of imperialistic ambition to inflict a strategic defeat on the Russians, we have in fact, created a catastrophe. We've destroyed this country.
That's right.
For some very dubious geopolitical purpose. Go.
That's right. And I think one of the most damning things about Istanbul is that nowhere in any of the accounts, even in the accounts that kind of dismiss its importance or its potential, nowhere do you read the U.S. State Department was adamant in pushing the Ukrainians into, pursuing a negotiated settlement. At no place in any of these accounts do you see the United States putting diplomacy first and foremost, right?
No.
Utterly absent.
Because as you have so eloquently, wrote in your assessment of Mr. Blinken's performance, if we can call what he's doing, a performance. Um, they're not interested in diplomacy. They're interested in pursuing the exact opposite of diplomacy, and that's the fundamental problem we have here, James. We have diplomats, so-called diplomats, who don't actually perform their duties. Right, the days of George Shultz are gone.
Yep.
Now we have, hacks, as they would say, and I don't mean the so-called, Russian hacks of against the Democrats
Right.
in the 2016 election. I'm talking about, which of course that was also another, fake. I'm talking about, political hacks, frankly, people who are not good diplomats at all. I mean, they're not interested. They're interested in the rhetoric of confrontation, of war, but not diplomacy, not the art of diplomacy, not the art of American diplomacy. And that's I think the fundamental problem with where we are now.
I agree. So let's circle back to Russia, and we're at the beginning of 2024, and so over in Russia, there's a presidential election coming up rather soon in March. And I was recently reading a piece in The Nation, which is published by a mutual friend of ours. And it was about Yavlinsky.
And actually, it was more of an interview, really. We're talking about an interview.
What did you think about these efforts on his part, to prevail upon the Kremlin to, pursue a ceasefire? And what kind of support does someone like that have among the, general electorate out in Russia? Americans are often, I think, wrongly led to believe that opposition figures like Navalny have, massive public support. And, if
Navalny does not have massive public support. I mean, that at most he has maybe 2% support. Even especially now, he wouldn't have any support. But I think that when we look at this, so Mr. Yavlinsky, who is the head of Yabloko, Russian liberal opposition party, he is trying to, persuade the Kremlin, or he was attempting to try and persuade the Kremlin to go into negotiations on Ukraine, to have a ceasefire.
Right.
Okay, which is all fine and good. Everybody wants peace. And in particular, you can make the case now that when we look at the horrific casualties that the Ukrainians are taking, and the fact that so many young men have died, that now they're bringing old men to the front, they're bringing young kids to the front, they're taking kids off the streets in various Ukrainian cities to go fight against their will. Now there's talk about drafting women to fight in this horrific war in Ukraine, which didn't need to happen, as most wars don't need to happen. But the problem here is that from the Kremlin's point of view, and from the point of view of the majority of Russians, they fear that if they were to freeze the conflict now, and to turn this into kind of like a frozen conflict, and you hear increasingly in the West, especially in Western press, this call that, well, not to continue the war, but to freeze the war. Okay. From the point of view, in particular, of the Kremlin, but also large segments of Russian society, in fact, the majority of Russian society, they would see that, okay, yes, so majority of the Russian society would want peace. Everybody wants peace. The Kremlin itself, would prefer to see this war end. But the problem is, if you just freeze the conflict with no long-standing resolution, no peace treaty, nothing is stopping the Western powers from arming Ukraine again and building up Ukraine, and then in 10 years from now, maybe starting a new war. Right? That's how the Kremlin looks at it in particular, and also how, like I said, large numbers of Russians view it. That if you freeze the war now, without a decisive victory by our side, by the Russian side, then what's not stopping the West I mean, excuse me, what's preventing the West then from building up Ukraine and then starting a new war like in 10 years' time? That's how they see it. And especially what they would point to are the statements by Angela Merkel and by Francois Hollande, where they both said unambiguously that Minsk was a ploy. It was all done to buy time to build up Ukraine. So now the Russians are going to trust much less any kind of ceasefire agreement. And actually, from the Kremlin's point of view, it would also make Yavlinsky less trustworthy. Why is Yavlinsky all of a sudden coming to us and asking for the ceasefire at this time? Why of all times now, when easily he's in concert almost with the Western media narrative? So I don't think it's going to. I mean, I feel for Mr. Yavlinsky. I agree with him, especially when he says, personally, Russia and Ukraine are very dear to me. They are like my right and left hands, right? And the vast majority, James, of Russians would agree with that, point of view, would agree with that sentiment because Ukraine and Russia, their histories, their historical ties, their cultural ties, familial ties, they're deeply, deeply interlinked, interconnected.
How do you
Deeply.
suppose that, how do you suppose Ukrainians feel about that, though?
Well, it's a tough call because I think that the people of Ukraine just want the war to end. I think that the Narod, the actual people, don't want the war. But I think that
I'm wondering if that sentiment, though, it cannot be widely shared in the West anymore, if it ever was, in the Western part of the country, if it ever was, right?
well, are you talking about like the what exactly are
Yeah,
you talking about? The interconnections or the
yeah,
desire to stop the war?
no, no, no.
Because those are okay.
Yeah, no,
So
the
the
interconnection.
interconnections, it's difficult to say, and it's difficult to say because we've had no reliable polling information out of Ukraine, certainly since the beginning of this war, and then even you could take it back to 2014. We have not had, really kind of reliable polling on popular attitudes within Ukraine because the regimes that have been in power since the Maidan have not been exactly in favor of free speech. They've been very repressive toward any kind of pro-Russian sentiments, any kind of, Russian language expression. So it's hard to really get very honest opinions from people about how they really feel. Although the one thing I can probably say is that the majority of regular folks don't want to see this war continue. They
Right.
don't want to see their loved ones, sent to the front, especially now. So despite whatever, Mr. Borrell or Ursula or any of these, Eurocrats say in Brussels, the majority of Ukrainian people probably don't want to be, don't want to see. I mean, certainly if we're talking about, mothers, wives, girlfriends, they don't want to see, their loved ones out there, be mowed down in this horrific war. So I think that there is probably most likely a majority of Ukrainians who, deep down inside, even if they don't express it explicitly, really want to see this war end in some way. Right now, of course, as you get to more nationalistic parts of Ukraine, they would want to end the war more on a principled basis on their terms, and all this and that. But the problem is, realistically, increasingly, it does not look likely that that can be achieved.
Well, I think in the remaining time that we have left, we have about 5 minutes or so left. I do want to turn to a topic that I know is near and dear to your heart, Armenia. So with your help, I went over there a couple of months ago and had very fruitful discussions and learned a lot about what was going on. Do you want to take us through the latest with regard to Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the kind of simmering?
Well, the latest, I mean, the biggest event that happened recently with regard to Armenia and Azerbaijan was the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh in September 2023. The exodus of the Artsakh Armenians, Karabakh Armenians. And this, of course, unfortunately, was rooted in the decision by the Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan to recognize Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan. which effectively, I mean, it really significantly tied the hands of the Russian peacekeepers. Also, the Armenian government under Pashinyan has been pursuing a very antagonistic line toward Russia. And so those are more or less the kind of developments. And there seems to be a very concerted effort on the part of the West to have Armenia to really encourage Armenia to pursue that path of abandoning Artsakh, even though it's their compatriots. There's a long history there of Artsakh with regard to not only the history of Armenia, but in specifically Eastern Armenia, that is to say, post-Soviet Armenia. That despite all that history, despite all those cultural ties, despite the fact that these are their people, this is the ethnic kin, these are Armenians, that effectively the Armenian government decided to abandon them, and the West wants to pursue kind of a peace treaty where the Armenian government gives Baku everything it wants unconditionally, simply to push Russia out of the region. Right? And this is not a new idea, by the way, James. This is something that war hawks, people in what we would call the American War Party, neoconservative thinkers, for decades have been scheming, dreaming, and writing about. Right? Azerbaijan was positioned as kind of a bridgehead for many American war hawks and neoconservatives to use against Russia and Iran, and also to push not only Russia out of the Caucasus, but eventually, in the longer vision, in the bigger vision, to push Russia even out of Central Asia, right? So that's what we're seeing right now. Now, the Russian peacekeepers are still in Artsakh and Nagorno-Karabakh, even though the Armenian population is not there. Most of the Armenians have fled. So Russia, ideally, the problem they have is that their peacekeeping mission is much more tenuous now without a population to safeguard. Yeah. And there is a serious threat of Russia, actually, being pushed out of the region, given the most recent developments. But I don't think they're not going to leave. I think that they have a lot of cards up their sleeve to still play in this game. And they are not going to abandon Armenia. They're not going to abandon the Caucasus. They're not even going to abandon Artsakh. I would even go so far as to say that I think that at the end of the day, Russia has a very strong geopolitical interest. They don't trust Turkey. They play kind of a game of frenemies with Turkey, where sometimes they're cooperating with them, sometimes they're in conflict with them. But the Russians, their main strategic partner, even ally in that region increasingly, is Iran. And if you saw, for instance, the 3+3 summit in Tehran, where really it was more like 3+2, where you had the Armenian foreign minister, you had Lavrov, you had the Iranian foreign minister, the Turkish foreign minister, Azerbaijani, you could see already the Armenian foreign minister, Mirzoyan, he was on the outs, right? But the Russia and Iran were getting together in their camp. Turkey and Azerbaijan were getting together in their camp, so you could kind of see where the region was more or less going. And one of the claims, one of the assertions actually I make is that actually the crises and wars that Armenia has recently experienced, those actually reflect the fact that Armenia is much more geopolitically significant than many Western commentators and even Armenian commentators have been saying for many years, that they were thinking, oh, we don't have oil and so therefore we're not, geopolitically important. Well, when Armenia had a state that represented its own interests, when they had a state that was more or less together under Serge Sargsyan, they had more or less the situation under control. In Armenia, in Artsakh, there was no reason for Russia to directly get involved. There was no reason for Iran to get directly involved. But now all of a sudden, we're seeing that in the absence of an Armenian government that represents the Armenian people, now all of a sudden, Iran is getting involved, Russia is getting involved, because they want to preserve their influence in that region, which indicates that Armenia as a state, as an area, as part of the larger Transcaucasian region, is really quite significant. They see it as part of this puzzle piece of this larger region. So without Armenia there, de facto, with a government in Armenia, in Yerevan, that's out to lunch, suddenly we see much more, foreign intrigue and much more activity on the part of Iran and Russia.
Well, unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our time. I would like to have you back soon, and we could pick up the discussion on Armenia and also touch upon your um, book and other developments. So I
Absolutely.
thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me on, James. It's a great pleasure as always. And I would love to be back to give you more insights on Russia, on life here. There's a lot more to talk about. Of course, we don't have enough time now to talk about it, but there's much more, to touch upon. But I appreciate, being your guest tonight on your show. And as always, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.